Okay, first thing we're going to do is put up my Patreon information. You'll see that in the chat, and you'll also see it in the bottom of the description. When you get to this late, for people getting to this later, they're just going to see it in the bottom of the description. For ones that actually want to go and donate, that would really help me for those who can. Now, with this topic is we're going to go over Herman Cain to the Federal Reserve. Does this really matter? Now, first we want to go over the idea, what is the Federal Reserve? Basically what this is this is what we need to look over is this is really the United States central banking service. And we need to understand with that is, with central banking, we need to realize that this is not what you find in a free market economy. This is what would be a planned economy. And when we realize this, this is something that is actually what leads us to know that that we are not a true fully free market economy. And this is one of the major things that actually shows it. Whenever you see a country with a central bank, you will see a country that actually has, to a certain degree, a planned economy. And you know, it's not planned from the planned from every aspect. It's still essentially planned from the financial part of it, because you actually have a central bank. And when you do this, this actually causes a great deal of problems, because you have essentially, at one aspect, you have the market itself trying to deal with itself as it would in a normal manner. The other way is you have this central bank trying to pull it in a different way and trying to restrain it into whatever way that it, and skew it into whatever way it wants it and it views it needs to be. Basically pulling it away from different things. It could be from a market correction. It could be which would be for one or more reasons. It could be reinflating the economy. It could be trying to deflate it back down for whatever reason, but essentially pulling it away from its natural state. And this gets us into our second question: what does it do with the economy? Essentially, what it's doing is manipulating the economy. And this is a big problem, because it's not letting the economy function on its own will. And when we start to look at this, we will see that it's actually acting in a big way that it is acting in such a manner that it will actually basically that it will basically continue to adjust the way the market's going to react. And when it does this, it's going to when it does these things, it's going to basically change the when it basically does this, it will it'll basically set the thing of where it needs to be, of the standard for the when we get to the whole point of how we deal with where was I at? Sorry, I was adjusting my video. But when we get to the whole point of it adjusts the way the economy is going to react. Now, what the economy is going to do on its own is try to adjust with this. Now, when we get to the next point, which is it usurping the role of Congress? Well, actually, yes, because when we see the role of Congress's their role is to actually to coin money. And we can see that what they're doing is essentially, number one is it's by printing money, you're actually that's counterfeit money, number one, because that's not even constitutional, number one. And number two is by setting the by basically going over their heads and using the Department of Finance in the executive to set the amounts of what's going out for money distribution and to the banks, and setting interest rates. You're basically adjusting what's happening in the banking world, which is what's happening in the financial world, and it's essentially usurping the role of what Congress is supposed to do. And this is essentially what you're adjusting, and they're doing this but what Congress is doing, Congress is allowing this to happen because they're monetizing the debt. And what this means essentially is they're basically covering the debt, and they're finding people to hold the debt that Congress wouldn't normally have the access to. Normally, they would have to go through the process of issuing bonds, and those bonds would then have to be bought by consumers, and that's usually a much longer process. But what they can do is they can then pick it up and then sell it directly off as bonds. But it's still under the ownership of the United States consumer. Mind you, this is not anything... the debt is still under the United States consumer, despite what people on MMT want to believe. People want to believe that the Federal Reserve owns it. The Federal Reserve does not own it. They're merely a third party. They're merely just a third party seller of this debt. No different than when we're dealing with a third party that might sell off a mortgage. They're not essentially, they have no dealings with it other than selling off that mortgage into the other party that owns that mortgage then. And if you do not pay that mortgage, which is a loan, you basically you are essentially defaulting on it. And that's the whole thing. That's where a lot of MMT people do not understand how this economy works. And when we get to the next part is how much is it impacting the economy? Well, when you're taking up the whole financial industry, and when there's not much actual legitimate production of goods actually happening within the country, and when you've become more of a service economy, that means that you're controlling a great portion of the economy. And you're pretty much going to control the majority of the economy with what you're doing at this Federal Reserve. And you're pretty much going to have a grip on the economy. In normal cases, you would even if you had an economy that had a robust economy that was developed on a lot of producing of goods, it still would have a massive impact over those, because it could essentially start to inflate or deflate the currency, which would have a massive impact on the way the economy is running, despite what the actual free market portion of it was actually trying to pull and skew it from the actual centrally planned portion. Now we get to the next portion of it, which is could the market do better than the centrally planned banking system that controls the financial markets? And this is an obvious yes with it, because if we look at the results of what the number one, we can look at the results of what the centrally planned banking has done since 1913, and we can see that it's disastrous. We can see that number one, we look at the massive amount of debt that's actually built up, and we can see that that's just gargantuan. Everything then about $3 million is pretty much can be attributed to the actual Federal Reserve itself. We can see that the actual welfare warfare state is actually directly attributed to the actual central banking system. We can actually see, because they've told them that they'll basically monetize the debt. We can actually also see that that when we start to look at it, is that the economic recessions and crashes that have actually happened from it are actually directly attributed to merely corrections in the actual market, that they were actually caused by bubbles that were actually been inflated by the actual central banking. This has been noted by several different people, and if you notice beforehand that these things actually lasted a very short period, when we have if we actually had a problem from the actual market-based solution, which is basically relying on the people choosing the actual values of interest rates, people choosing the whole, or I should say the whole market choosing the value of interest rates, whole market choosing the value of the money itself. And what ends up happening is those economic situations end up being very, very short. Now, when we have it with this, we see that the actual economic hardships end up lasting a lot longer, and that's due to a lot of the intervention. Now we look at the next part, which is what would actually happen beforehand. Is the next kind of section of this question. Is you look beforehand, it was actually proves the actual point that it was actually a lot more mild. If you look at after the point, we can after this point we can see that these situations lasted a lot longer. You look at the point of under FDR, you can see that the crashes lasted a lot longer. He even put through two New Deals, and both of which were considered failures. Most people think it was just one New Deal. It wasn't. It was actually the first one was such a great failure that he had to repeat it, and that was such a great failure that he actually went to war with it, and even that did not pull us. That did not really pull us out of the economic problems. Now, these economic problems initially were actually caused by the issues from central banking. If you go back to the actual causes of this, and along with, obviously, there were bad policies as well, but when we go back to what actually really kind of made the situation worse, it was central banking. And and this is what caused the crash of 29. And it didn't have to last, God knows, what are we talking, well over a decade, because of central banking, when most experts state that it could have been over within a few months, no more than about 6 months. And you're talking, that's over 10 years next to 6 months. And there were so many people that actually killed themselves over that. And then we get to the point of, we see that this whole group doesn't have real oversight, because because even though you can do a generic audit on some of their transactions that happen within the U.S., they can't do an audit of anything outside of that, and they cannot do an audit on their actual decision making of what actually happens. Basically, it cannot be equal to an actual full audit. And this is an actual problem. And this is what needs to be understood when we're actually discussing policy with them. And when it comes time to discuss getting those full audits, which you need the bill to come up, which is the Federal Reserve Transparency Act. When that comes up, they're out there basically spending money, which is money that's not actually theirs, but spending money to actually lobby against the actual ability for the actual transparency and be able to get a full audit on the Federal Reserve, and they're lobbying against it. Now, what does this all have to do with Herman Cain on the Federal Reserve? Well, does this even matter to begin with? Well, when we're talking about policy, is we can see over the actual history of the organization that really they've always stuck to a Keynesian economics policy of this classic central banking and monetizing debt and continuing the problems going of more and more spending for the actual welfare warfare state. And when it comes down to that, is it doesn't matter who you put on the board, it always stays the same. And until you get rid of this beast, and the way you get rid of it is you start out with that full audit, and then you have people in Congress seeing what's really going on. You see that it is anti-American to actually have this type of system going, and then you make them realize that it's not good to have central banking, and then you make them realize that the best option to go forward is to eliminate central banking, and that this was the actual cause of this income disparity to begin with. And when you have the people on the left start to realize, well, central banking caused it, and that you can't use central banking to fix it because it was the cause to begin with of all this income disparity, that and it can't be fixed. And then you have people on the right that realize that if you want to fix the problem, you need to eliminate it, and you can get to the problem of basically eliminating it. Now, this will basically switch the way governments run, and you only can spend what comes in. And this is going to have to shift government and policy. We wouldn't be able to be this guardians of the whole world and all these other things like this. We would have to shift policy, and you only can spend what comes in. Now, this would essentially change a lot of things, and a lot of the policies they want to enact would never have a shot to be enacted because of this. So people on the MMT, guess what? Your MMT ideas are gone. We're going to have to go into an Austrian economic system. That's the only system that would actually fit. Every other economic system would be dead. It wouldn't even have any ability to be taught anymore, because they would have no more function in the United States. It would be basically maybe a little bit of a footnote, but it would have no other function, because using it wouldn't even have any legitimacy when it comes to government policy. And because you wouldn't, you could be taught it, but you wouldn't have any use to actually put it put it into play. And if you tried to, it would be completely illegitimate. And when we start to look at it, we start to realize that that it would basically be at the point where you could not have people out there that are actually going out and being taught these things, because they would be completely illegitimate. And that would be because that would be completely pointless. And that would be the end of those theories. They would just be nothing but footnotes. At least in the United States. I mean, overseas with it, they would still have usage. But for the United States itself, it wouldn't have any usage anymore. And that's why, because the fact is, we see that central banking is really pointless, because it leads to the collapse of a country, and it's just for lining the pockets of people. And if you start to read up on the Rothschild family, that's kind of how they got all their money. And this isn't some conspiracy theory. This is actually a fact. If you read how the Rothschild family got their money, you'll actually read that that's kind of where they got it, and they've actually kind of attached themselves to all the central banks, and that's kind of where we got the actual income disparity across the globe. And they're more one of those ones that kind of stay quiet, because if people kind of realize this, then central banking is going to shut down internationally, and they're going to people are going to say, well, hey, if this is what happened, we want to shut down all the central banks. And that's where you're going to find that happen, because that would essentially create people going in the opposite direction. Now, the central banks are essentially, the reason why they want that is because you can kind of trim off a little bit of money off everybody's cash flow, because you can keep printing more money, and you can kind of take the money through inflation. And that inflationary money over decades means you're going to get very, very wealthy. Meanwhile, that's not your money, but you're actually doing it through technically stealing, but it's in a technicality that's legal. And that's essentially what central banking is. Now you end that, and essentially that theft has to end too. And you're going to see from then on forward, everything is going, and if you tie everything to a precious metal directly with it, or make precious metals your actual currency, you're going to see specifically that you're not going to find these disparities happening in the future, because you don't have anybody to siphon off the income. And that's what ends up happening. People need to understand that the Federal Reserve is not a government agency. It's actually technically semi-private. This is where it tends to get into that area with it, and this is where it wants to stay. It realizes that if the government's allowed to assign its its board members, and but it's allowed to kind of keep this somewhat private entity. It allows it to kind of escape the regulations of different things like the SEC. It can escape those regulations, and it also can escape normal government regulations that it would normally be subject to. But it can kind of sit in this kind of limbo, and that limbo allows it to have this extreme amount of power that it wouldn't normally have, and that's what makes it kind of very, very unique. And that's why people need to be very, very aware of what's going on there. And this is why when we talk about Herman Cain to the Federal Reserve, it doesn't matter who they put there. They could put Mickey Mouse there, for as far as I'm concerned. It doesn't matter who they're putting there. It doesn't. The actual person doesn't matter, because the fact is they're just kind of more of a puppet for what's going on. It's the man behind the curtain that actually matters, and who's actually the investors that are actually in the actual Federal Reserve, who are actually making the money from this. And those are the ones that are actually the ones that are the ones who are actually benefiting from this, is the ones who are actually the ones you should actually be concerned with. It's not who's actually on the board. That's really illegitimate when it comes down to everything, because they're just going to keep basically doing the whole usual thing of monetizing the debt and keeping the policy going forward. If you end the actual link between them and the government, then this whole thing ends. And this is where people with MMT don't understand this. They think that the Federal Reserve owns this debt. The Federal Reserve doesn't own anything. They don't own any bit of debt except for the debt that they've added to their balance sheet. This is basically their own investment debt, and their investment debt is purely within the housing, under the housing crisis, nothing more. If you look at their actual balance sheets, that's all they have. They don't have the debt that's under our country. Most people, the actual people under MMT, don't understand that. They don't have this $22 trillion of debt. That's being held by people who actually hold the bonds of debt. These are countries like China and Russia. You don't pay them, they get mad, and they're going to request that you reimburse them when it comes down to the actual money. And that this is what I've heard from people for MMT. They think that it's the Federal Reserve that owns them with it, and we don't have to pay them. Well, yeah, you do. You have to pay the debt owners. Though the debt owners are not the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve has nothing to do with that debt. The owners, we're the people that own the debt, which is the actual American citizens, and we have to pay off these countries, which are China, which are Russia, amongst others. We also have other groups, such as the U.S. Postal Workers Union is another one that actually owns a lot of the debt. A lot of people don't realize that, and I don't think you're going to be I don't think they're going to be very, very happy. My father is one of the people who actually gets his pension from them. This is what their pension's tied into, and I don't think he's going to be very, very happy when you see the federal government try to stiff them. And you're not going to see a lot of people who are going to be very, very happy with that, and that's quite a few people, and they're actually within the country, and so they're going to be quite pissed when they basically try to stiff a debt. And they're actually one of the highest debt holders of the federal debt. And when we start to look at this, you're going to see that there's a lot of holders of these debt, and they don't want to be stiff. So basically, you're going to have to essentially offer them land, and this land is essentially state land, and you're going to have to offer this in exchange. And this means essentially giving away people's property, and that's going to be the next option. essentially handing away property to these debt holders. And they're going to have to essentially try to gather as much property that is either state or federal property, and they're going to have to gather as much as they can and give it away. Because they don't, to accommodate the debt. Because otherwise they're basically going to have to state, sorry, we don't have this money to accommodate you because of X. And it's because we don't have this money to pay off, because some moron economist decided wrongly, because we didn't owe the money and we thought we were going to stiff you. And that's where you get the MMT people who don't know anything at all. That's why when it comes down to this Federal Reserve, our best option is essentially to get rid of them. They still owe the money that they owe with it is their money with it. That's they're on their own with that. But that's basically about six. I think it's like something like 6 trillion or something is on their debt. Is on their sheets or something. Or, 3 or 6 trillion or something like that. But that's in housing or something. Or is it a billion or something? I forgot what the way it works out to be on their sheets with it. It might be billion with it. Might be about 6 billion on their sheets, but I forgot what it actually works out to be. But it's basically from the housing crisis. It might be trillion with it, because because of the of that housing crisis. So it might be like 3 trillion or something. So it's basically whatever started out with it. So they basically own all of that money, and that's what's on their income on their balance sheets currently. So what they're at is they basically still have those, and those essentially are on the balance sheets of the Federal Reserve, and those essentially would be owned by them. And that's the only thing that they're responsible for. That's not essentially on government ownership. That would be completely separate. And that was based on their own decision for quantitative easing. Part of the whole quantitative easing movement was buying up toxic mortgages and taking up those property values and doing that. And that's what ended up loading up their balance sheet. Now, when we start to look at that, that means they're on the hook for that stuff. So that's their option. But anything else that we rack up, when we start to look at the U.S. national debt clock, at that 22 billion trillion 181 billion 399 million and change, that's essentially what we're on the hook for. And we could see that basically we're going to keep adding on more, and it keeps going up by the second. And it just keeps going up, and we just hit we just keep going, and we'll keep going up. And as if you set it out to what's estimated on 2023, it's set to be at about 27 trillion. Now this is, if you look at it, that's just going to be way too high. And when you start to put that out to being debt per citizen, that's about $268,930. Debt per family would be over $1 million. And we would see, and that's what we'd see, and that's the whole problem. And this is, and we could pretty much put the blame back on the Federal Reserve. We go back to 1980, we can see we were not even at $1 trillion at that point. This is the year before I was born. And we weren't even at $1 trillion, yet we look at now, and we can see that we're over at 22 trillion, and this is horrible. We look at 2000, this is the year I graduated high school, and we weren't even at 6 trillion at this time. And we could and that year we were actually developing a surplus. So we were actually at the benefit of cutting money. And we start to go back to even like 2004, we were still not even at 8 trillion. I mean, we can just see this with it. And that's the problem, is when we start to look at it, is this is really what we end up having. And when you start to go back at the start of the point, we'll see that the value of what we started at was about, before we end up getting central bank, it was about $3 million. And we could basically say that the amount of money that we've actually digged a hole with, has been horrible. And if we start to use even based on the approximate thing of just inflation of what we had right at the same time of when we had the value, that would of the amount that we had in debt, that doesn't even equal out to about $77 million. That should give you a little bit of a clue to what we are doing now. That would have been like equal to back then if we had about 861 million back then. Or no, sorry, sorry, 861 billion. Approximately would have been about equal to $861 billion would have been what they would have had to have in comparison to just equal out what they have now in just today's terms. And that's just to kind of get a general idea. But 861 and 862 billion dollars. And that should give you an idea of kind of where they're at. And this is why when we talk about central banking, we need to understand that it really doesn't matter who's in charge. We can see that basically what they've done. And when we look at basically, they started out with about $3 million before central banking started. And we can see basically just on the rates, just to equal out to what they've actually done, is that the rates would have actually been, just to do what they've done on an even rate, they would have had to, just on inflation, they would have actually, at the level now, they would have actually had to have over $800 billion. And that amount would have been unfathomable. They would never have even thought to even have that kind of money in debt. If you would have actually said, okay, we're going to have the amount of debt to be over $800 billion, they would have laughed at you. They're like, how can you spend that kind of money and get just in debt, just to have overspend that amount of money? And they would have unbelievably laughed at you. And now and that's just the amount that you have had to get there just to go with the inflation rates. And that's basically what we're looking at now, and this is basically what we're looking at, and that's just to show you, and to show you what is actually been happening. And that shows you dollar to dollar what it would have actually looked like back then. And even per year is, we're adding over $1 trillion per year. Now, if we look at other countries, I mean, the Philippines themselves actually historically have only added about $500 billion in their history of debt. That is about what we add on a good year when we're actually being a little more fiscally responsible. And that's what they've added totally in their history. Now, this should actually get us a little bit of a sign of what we're doing, how fiscally irresponsibly we're being. You look at what Canada's done. Canada's not done anywhere near what we've done, and yet when they add a little bit of debt, they start what it calls screaming that they want to hang a person because they're adding too much debt, and yet we're willing to add so much debt into our system. I mean, we're adding between $500 billion and $1 trillion. Now, we could easily cut this out. I mean, it doesn't take much effort. You start looking through things. Number one is basically end all public aid for people who are not disabled, and end our militarization overseas, shut down all of our bases overseas, and bring it down to just defending the United States and its territories, a cost of about $250 billion. This means not only would we actually save money, we can actually put it toward legitimate things and actually start paying off the debt. And this is actually showing you right there. And we can actually start reversing course of what the actual Federal Reserve has actually caused us. And maybe we can actually get rid of central banking. And because we would then no longer need it. We could then start distributing out, eliminating paper money, and start going with coin money as the Constitution states. And I'm probably just going to cut it right here with it, end it, because about 8:20 here with it. Just cut it for the night, and that'll be about it. And see you guys tomorrow. Bye, everyone.